The first time I saw Jessica Park's Fitbit, it was lying inside a glass evidence box, still scuffed with dirt from the sub-basement floor. The screen was cracked, but when we charged it, it lit up. For just a second. Long enough to flash one frozen number 0 beats per minute. Even after all these years, that moment still stops me cold, the small device that had tried so hard to tell us where she was. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from and share this if you believe remembering is the first step toward justice. In the spring of 2016, Portland had a kind of calm that made you forget bad things could happen here. I'd retired from active duty that January, spending my mornings walking my dog along the Willamette and my afternoons fixing up an old Ford pickup in the garage. The city was waking up early those days, joggers in bright shirts, espresso machines, hissing from every corner cafe, the smell of wet pavement after a light rain. 2 blocks over lived Jessica and Ryan Park. They were the kind of couple neighbors liked, without really knowing polite waves, friendly smiles, never loud. Jessica worked at a marketing firm downtown. Ryan was an engineer who built prototypes for a small tech outfit. I used to see Jessica running before sunrise, that coral-colored shirt easy to spot against the gray. She always waved as she passed my driveway, earbuds and ponytails swinging. Even at that hour, she looked awake in a way most of us weren't. Portland mornings can feel like living inside a cloud. In March, the air carries that damp chill about 42 degrees, with the river mist curling low over the water. You can hear the distant hum of the interstate, a train horn somewhere in the valley, and the faint chatter of crows waiting for daylight. People keep to themselves here, but in a friendly way, nods at crosswalks, a wave to the mail carrier, someone setting out recycling just as the sun comes up. That neighborhood believed in order. Kids caught their buses at the same stop every day. Porch lights flicked off by 7. And every morning around 6, like clockwork, Jessica ran her 3-mile loop from Northeast Alama Street to Fremont and back. I'd see her breath in the cold air, a soft white trail fading behind her. She never missed a run, not in the rain, not even when she'd twisted her ankle the winter before. Her husband Ryan was quieter. We'd talk sometimes on Saturdays when he mowed the lawn. He had the patient way of a man who thought twice before speaking. Loved old rock records, fixed things himself, didn't waste words. When Jessica got her Fitbit for Christmas that year, he'd joked about how she checked it more than her phone. But he liked seeing her happy, said it pushed her to run farther, sleep better, live cleaner. It was a small thing, that bracelet, but it meant something between them. I remember one Saturday in early March, the Parks hosted a little get-together. Neighbors brought pie, kids played tag under the porch light. Jessica was laughing with a friend about her upcoming half-marathon. She had this way of talking with her hands animated but graceful. Ryan grilled burgers in the yard, smoke drifting through the trees. It was just another evening in a safe corner of the city, nothing remarkable about it. A week later, I noticed her coral running shirt flash past my window again, same pace, same stride. The world was still half asleep, street lamps humming the scent of rain on cedar. She lifted a hand in that familiar wave, and I lifted mine back from the porch. I didn't know it then, but that was the last time I'd ever see her move under her own strength. At the time, everything still felt ordinary. My dog barked at a passing squirrel. A garbage truck clattered down the next street. A jogger's rhythm faded into the distance. But looking back, I remember something small. The sound of tires slowing at the corner where she turned headlights, pausing just a little too long before rolling on. I told myself it was nothing. In neighborhoods like ours, you convince yourself you're safe. The days that followed carried the same rhythm, the mail arriving at noon, church bells echoing from across the river, the faint scent of pine when the rain finally stopped. I spent those evenings sanding the truck's hood, the radio playing soft, old country tunes. Across the street, Ryan and Jessica's lights flickered through the blinds, her office lamp glowing late, his silhouette moving between rooms. There was comfort in that small routine, knowing who was home, who was out for groceries, who'd left their porch light on too long. On March 14th, the night before it all began, a thin fog settled over the neighborhood. You could see your breath under the streetlights. I remember passing the park house around 9, walking my dog. Jessica's running shoes were lined neatly on the mat, drying from that evening's short jog. Through the window, I caught a glimpse of her at the kitchen counter, head bent over her phone, maybe checking that step count again. Ryan stood beside her with a mug of tea. Domestic quiet, utterly normal. When you've spent your life in law enforcement, you learn to read silence. Some silences are peaceful, others carry weight. That night, there was nothing unusual in the air. No sign of the shadow that was about to stretch across all our lives. Just the steady tick of sprinklers, the low hum of distant traffic, and the sense that tomorrow would come like every other day, one foot in front of the other. A morning run, a cup of coffee, a routine intact. I went to bed early, rain tapping against the window, my dog curled at my feet. The city outside was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels earned after a long winter. Around 6 the next morning, I woke to the same sound I always did. Footsteps on pavement steady and light, a runner passing through the fog. I didn't get up to look. I didn't need to. I thought I already knew who it was. By that evening, her porch light was still on. The kind of warm yellow glow that tells you someone's expected home any minute. Only this time, the door never opened, and the light stayed burning long after the street went dark. I remember that evening, like a photograph burned into the back of my mind. Jessica's porch light was still glowing when I drove past on my way to the store. Ryan's truck sat in the driveway, the curtains drawn, that faint blue flicker of a television spilling across the living room wall. Everything looked fine, quiet, lived in. But the next morning, by the time the sun came up, something in the air felt wrong. It's hard to explain, but those of us who've worn a badge for long enough can tell when a silence doesn't fit the shape of the morning. Around 8 o'clock, my phone rang. It was one of the guys from the precinct saying a runner had been reported missing in my neighborhood. I didn't need him to say the name. I knew. He asked if I still had my keycard clearance and if I'd mind coming down to the scene. I told him I'd be there in 10 minutes. When I pulled onto Alama Street, I saw Ryan standing near the curb. His hands pressed to his forehead, talking with 2 uniformed officers. A cruiser's lights turned slow circles across the houses, washing the gray street in red and blue. Jessica's running route started right there, 3.1 miles, looping through the same streets she'd been running for years. Ryan said she'd left the apartment at 6 sharp, like always. He'd kissed her goodbye, watched her from the window as she crossed toward the east end of the block. By 7, she should have been home. At 8, when she still wasn't back, he called her cell. Straight to voicemail. At 9, he tried again. Same result. He got in his truck, drove her route twice, then finally called the police. I remember the way he looked at me when I walked up. "She doesn't just disappear," he said, voice shaking but controlled. "She always comes back." He kept saying it like he was trying to convince himself. I told him to stay with one of the uniforms while I took a look around. The morning was overcast, the kind of pale light that flattens everything. Her tracks were still faintly visible on the damp sidewalk, shoe prints heading east, then lost in the dry patch near the curb. We pulled her Fitbit data through the app she synced daily. The last update was logged at 6:34 that morning. Heart rate 142 beats per minute, GPS pinned half a mile from home. Then nothing. It was as if she'd been erased right there on that street. A scent dog arrived by mid-morning. The handler walked her slow along the route the leash taught the dog, pulling toward a section of sidewalk near a chain-link fence. Then suddenly it stopped. Nose up, confused. The handler shook his head, scent gone like she'd been lifted off the ground. No drag marks, no tire tracks deep enough to prove anything, just the faint smell of exhaust and wet asphalt. By noon, we had patrols canvassing the area, knocking on doors. Not a single neighbor had seen her pass. Not a single camera pointed the right way. It was one of those blocks that looked safe enough to be careless, no need for doorbell cams or security lights. Ryan came down to the command post around 3. He'd already given his statement twice. He told me she had a 9 a.m. meeting that morning. She was the kind who'd show up early, coffee in hand, always on time. Missing that meeting was the first red flag, but by then it was already too late to catch her trail. I drove the loop myself, 3 miles of residential streets, every mailbox and stop sign, feeling like it was watching me. We checked dumpsters, storm drains, construction sites, anything that could hide something or someone. As daylight faded, the temperature dropped into the 40s. Volunteers arrived with flashlights and flyers. I remember Ryan printing her photo on his home printer 1 sheet at a time, his hands shaking as the ink streaked on the paper. He gave me one. I still have it tucked inside a file that I never could bring myself to close. The first night, the search expanded out toward the river. Boats combed the water with spotlights. Nothing. Helicopters swept the streets until dawn. Still nothing. By the second day, the media got hold of it. Jessica's picture was everywhere, the smiling brunette in a coral running shirt frozen mid-laugh beside Ryan. Reporters camped outside their apartment. We asked Ryan to stay inside for a few days, let us handle it. He agreed, but every time I checked on him, he was sitting at the window staring down the street like she might just jog back any second. By the end of that week, we had no witnesses, no signs of struggle, and not a single lead that made sense. We subpoenaed nearby cell towers, no pings from her phone after 6:35. I met with the tech division, who said her Fitbit hadn't synced since that same minute. They figured the battery died or the device broke. That seemed logical then. It doesn't anymore. Portland PD treated it as a probable abduction within 48 hours. Ryan was questioned thoroughly more than once. He cooperated without protest, offered to take a polygraph, let them search the apartment, the vehicles, everything. They found nothing. He was cleared by the end of the month. Still, that didn't make the emptiness easier to bear. A missing persons case doesn't go quiet, it just hums low always, there waiting for someone to notice the next thing. April came and went. Spring bloomed around a hollow absence. Joggers kept running that same route, eyes glancing toward the spot on Alama where the scent trail ended. The city moved on, but I didn't. Even after retirement, I couldn't let it go. I'd drive those streets sometimes slow enough to feel the rhythm of her run, timing my turns. To match the data, we had 2.3 miles completed half a mile from home. Somewhere between those numbers, she was taken. I kept in touch with Ryan over the years. He remarried later quietly, but he never moved from that apartment. Said he wanted to stay close, just in case. The official file sat untouched in the cold case archive, gathering dust next to hundreds like it. That's how things go. Cases slip beneath the surface, buried under newer crimes, newer tragedies. But every so often, something stirs the surface again. 7 years passed before that happened. It was March of 2023, a gray Tuesday like any other. I was drinking coffee on my back porch when my phone buzzed with a number I didn't recognize, San Francisco area code. The man on the other end introduced himself as Marcus Webb. His voice was tight controlled, but there was something beneath it, a kind of disbelief that only comes when you know you've found something you're not supposed to. He told me he worked for Google in the department handling data migrations from old Fitbit servers. He'd come across an account that had been trying unsuccessfully to upload data for years. The name on the account was Jessica Park. At first I thought he'd made a mistake. Maybe it was a glitch or someone else with the same name. But Marcus said there was more. The device had logged heart rate motion and GPS data for 11 days after the date she went missing. I felt my throat tighten. He repeated it 11 days. The data had been stuck in a corrupted file, never processed until his team rebuilt the servers. It was all there, waiting. He said he'd already alerted Google's legal department and they'd contacted Portland PD. The cold case unit called me within the hour. I hadn't been inside that building in years, but when I walked through the door, I felt the same electric tension I used to feel before a case broke open. Detective Sarah Reeves was leading the review now. She met me at the entrance, laptop in hand, eyes wide. "You need to see this," she said. We sat in a small briefing room while Marcus shared his screen from California. The file unfolded like a silent confession. On March 15th at 6:34 and 16 seconds, Jessica's heart rate spiked from 142 to over 200 beats per minute. The GPS shifted by a few yards. Then the altitude dropped 40 feet. 40 feet straight down. Her heart rate steadied, then slowed. It stayed steady for days, low but alive. There was no doubt in my mind what that meant. She'd been taken somewhere underground, alive at least for a while. Sarah scrolled through the timeline, each line of data like a heartbeat on an EKG, spikes every few hours, then drops, then flat periods of stillness. The battery data showed slow decline, lasting 11 days before the signal died completely. We sat there in silence, the air heavy. I'd seen thousands of case files, but never anything like this technology acting like a witness, recording everything, powerless to speak until someone finally listened. We printed the coordinates and pulled up a map. The location fell right on top of the Alama storage and industrial complex, half a mile from Jessica's home. I'd driven past that building 100 times. Never thought twice about it. Sarah leaned back in her chair, whispering, she was right there. All this time. I couldn't answer. My mind was racing through every report, every search pattern, every oversight we'd made. 40 feet underground. How many times had we walked right over her? By the end of that day, warrants were being drafted, property records pulled. The company that owned the building had gone through several tenants, but one name from the old files stood out, a night security guard who'd been working there in 2016. The same week Jessica vanished, he'd been on shift. His name was Martin Torres. Sarah's voice dropped when she read it aloud. He had keys to everything. The room went still. Outside, rain began to tap against the windows, soft but steady. I looked at the printout of Jessica's data again, those 11 days, that unrelenting device recording every beat until the very end. I'd spent most of my life trying to read evidence left behind by the dead. But that night, sitting there under the hum of fluorescent lights, I realized this time the evidence hadn't been left behind. It had been waiting. It had been calling out for 7 years. And now, at last, someone had finally heard it. When I left the station, the city felt the same as it always had. Wet streets, faint smell of diesel, a jogger cutting through the fog. But inside I knew nothing about those familiar places would ever look the same again. Somewhere beneath the pavement of Northeast Alama Street, the truth had been buried alive, and now it was stirring to the surface. The next few days felt like walking through water, slow, heavy, and quiet in the wrong places. The new data had changed everything, but it also brought a kind of unease none of us wanted to name yet. We finally had coordinates, time stamps, a heartbeat that kept going long after Jessica vanished. And yet the closer we looked, the worse it felt. Sarah and I spent hours in that small, windowless office staring at charts that looked more like vital signs than evidence logs. Every spike and dip told us she'd been alive, trapped somewhere beneath the city, her heart still trying to keep time while the rest of the world moved on without her. We brought in a forensics analyst to verify the data integrity. The man's hands shook as he spoke. "This is clean," he said. "No tampering, no false positives. That device recorded everything it was built to record." The words landed like a stone in my gut. It meant there'd been no glitch, no malfunction to explain away what happened. Jessica had been alive down there. The coordinates placed her inside the old industrial block, a squat brick structure that hadn't seen a real renovation since the Reagan years. The building sat just east of the tracks, surrounded by cracked pavement and rusted fencing, the kind of place nobody paid attention to. We requested the original blueprints and got them the next morning, rolled sheets from the city archive that smelled like dust and oil. They showed an old heating system, a coal chute, and a narrow sub-basement that had been sealed in the early 80s. Sealed didn't always mean filled. Sometimes it just meant forgotten. By mid-afternoon, we had property records. The owner had leased out storage units to small businesses, auto parts, plumbing supplies, even a guy who refinished furniture. But one name stood out. Unit 47 rented under Martin Torres, age 38 at the time of Jessica's disappearance. Security clearance, night shift. No prior arrests, no complaints, just a quiet employee with keys to every door. He'd worked there for nearly a decade before being let go for unauthorized access to sealed areas. That line alone made every hair on my arm stand up. I pulled his old HR file and stared at the photo. Mid-40s, now dark eyes, trimmed beard, the kind of face you'd pass in a grocery store without a second thought. Sarah looked over my shoulder and said softly, "He was on duty the morning she vanished." It wasn't a question. We both knew what that meant. Surveillance started that evening. Unmarked cars outside his house, plainclothes agents tailing his route to and from work. He lived in a single-story ranch just outside the city limits, paint peeling on the eaves, wind chimes hanging by fishing wire. He didn't have much of a life on paper. No wife, no kids, a handful of credit cards, a steady pattern of solitary routines. But the quiet ones, I've learned, are the ones you watch the closest. While surveillance ran, the tactical team prepared warrants. We didn't want him knowing we were coming. Every hour that passed made the walls feel smaller. Sarah barely spoke. She'd taken this case personally. She'd been a patrol officer when Jessica vanished fresh out of training. Now she sat across from me, eyes red from staring at maps and timelines. "She was under our feet, Mike," she kept saying. "All that time. I didn't have an answer for her. Sometimes you can't talk your way around guilt." March 9th. Just after dawn, we moved. 2 teams, one to the house, one to the storage facility. I rode with the second. The air was cold, sharp enough to taste metal. The industrial complex loomed ahead quiet, but for the rattle of an old chain on the gate. The padlock gave way easily. We moved down the corridor, boots echoing on the concrete, the smell of dust and machine oil thick in the air. Unit 47's door was newer than the rest, fresh paint over rust. Inside was nothing but stacked crates and a heavy plywood wall that didn't match the architecture. Sarah ran her hand along it, then knocked. Hollow. The breach team went in first. The plywood came apart in splinters, revealing a narrow shaft descending into darkness. The light from our flashlights disappeared before hitting bottom. We rigged a rope and lowered the first tech down. He called out measurements, 40 feet, maybe a little more, and then silence. For a long moment, the radio crackled with nothing. Then his voice came through thin and strained. "You need to come see this." I climbed down, next the air growing colder as I descended. The smell hit me first, damp earth rot and something chemical. The chamber was small, barely 10 feet wide. The walls were stained with age concrete, flaking in gray curls. In the corner sat a rusted cot, an old mattress blackened with mold, empty water bottles scattered around. Chains bolted to the wall. Every inch of me went cold. Then the light caught something on the floor, metal glinting faintly in the dust. A bracelet still clasped around what was left of a wrist. The Fitbit, her Fitbit. The screen shattered but intact enough to read the engraving on the side. It was hers. She was there. After 7 years, we'd found her. The rest of the room was a crime scene frozen in time. There were blood traces near the bolts, the remains of fabric that once might have been a shirt, fragments of bone still bearing the faint coral tint of synthetic dye. The forensics team worked quietly, their movements careful, reverent even. Nobody spoke above a whisper. When we surfaced again, daylight felt strange, too bright, too clean for what we'd just seen. Sarah leaned against the wall, her face gray. "He kept her down there," she said. I nodded. The words didn't make it easier to hear. An hour later, we got word from the other team. Torres was in custody. They'd found jewelry at his house, pieces Ryan identified later as Jessica's. In a locked drawer were photographs, dozens of them, all taken without the subject's knowledge. Jessica appeared in more than 10. Running, standing at a crosswalk, sitting at a cafe window. He'd been watching her long before that morning. They brought him into interrogation that afternoon. I sat in the observation room with Sarah, watching through the glass. Torres didn't look scared. He didn't look anything. When the evidence was laid out in front of him, the photos, the jewelry, the recovered remains, he stared for a long time, then sighed, like a man caught in a lie, too old to keep up. His voice, when he finally spoke, was flat. He said he hadn't planned it, that he just wanted to keep her safe, words that made my skin crawl. He described how he waited for her run, how he used chloroform from a supply closet, how he carried her through that hidden shaft he'd carved open years earlier. He told us about the injections, the way he'd sedated her using stolen veterinary drugs. He said he didn't mean to let her die, that it just happened. But the data from that Fitbit told a different story, spikes in her heart rate every few hours, moments when consciousness returned before the drugs took hold again. 11 days of fading life in the dark. The final spike, the erratic rhythm, the flat line. The device had recorded the moment her heart stopped. He hadn't just let her die. He'd watched it happen. When the interview ended, Torres sat back in his chair, eyes half closed, like he'd been waiting years to tell someone. The room emptied around him, and for a second I wondered what silence would sound like inside a mind like his. Then I pushed the thought away. Some things don't deserve understanding. That night, after the evidence team wrapped up, Sarah and I stood outside the complex. The streetlights buzzed overhead, casting that dull orange wash across the concrete. She was 40 feet below where we stood that day, she said quietly. I didn't answer. The wind rattled the chain-link fence, carrying the faint echo of passing trains. There's something about cases like this. They don't end when you close the file. They sit with you, waiting in the dark corners of your thoughts. I went home and couldn't bring myself to turn on the lights. Sat at the kitchen table, staring at the folder, the printouts of her heartbeat like a silent testimony. The technology that recorded every second had done everything it could, but the signal never broke through the concrete. For 7 years it had tried. By the time I finally went to bed, dawn was coming. Outside my window, the city was waking buses, hissing at the curb, birds starting their morning racket, joggers hitting the pavement again, just like before. But I couldn't stop seeing that shaft in my mind, the narrow drop into darkness, the place where sound didn't reach. We'd found the truth, but it wasn't closure. It was just the next terrible step. 2 days later, I got the call that the prosecutor was filing charges, kidnapping, murder evidence tampering. It was the kind of news that should have felt like victory. Instead, I just looked at the clock, thought about how long Jessica had waited for someone to listen. That night, I drove back past her old street. The porch light at Ryan's house was still on, same soft glow as before. Only now it didn't feel like a light waiting for someone to come home. It felt like a vigil for something we'd finally found. Still, a question lingered in the back of my mind. The data had ended after 11 days, but the Fitbit had kept trying to sync for years afterward, thousands of failed attempts. I couldn't stop wondering what triggered those signals. What faint pulse of electricity had kept that little device alive, long after she was gone. Maybe it was nothing more than persistence built into the circuit. Or maybe somehow it was a trace of her refusing to be forgotten. Either way, the case had shifted. We had the man, we had the truth, but something deeper was starting to move, something that would carry this story far beyond the walls of that basement. And I knew even then that Jessica's voice hadn't finished speaking. It had only just been heard. I sat through the trial from the first morning until the final gavel, though I wasn't required to. It felt like something I owed her. After years of chasing a shadow, Jessica finally had a name attached to what happened to her, and I needed to see that name face justice. The courtroom was one of those older Portland halls with pale wood panels and light that poured through high windows, dust drifting like slow snowfall through the beams. People don't realize how quiet a courtroom can be so still that even a page turning sounds like thunder. Torres sat at the defense table flanked by his attorneys, his posture unnervingly calm. The prosecutors wheeled in a single black monitor. On its screen glowed a jagged green line that pulsed in time with her heartbeats. That device had tracked everything: the panic, the sedation, the final decline. The jurors couldn't take their eyes off it. They didn't need to be told what they were looking at. It was as human a record as anything I'd ever seen. When the medical examiner testified, the room seemed to hold its breath. He spoke about bone density, stress fractures, dehydration. But what made the silence deepen wasn't the science. It was when he said her watch kept transmitting, trying to find a signal through 40 feet of concrete. A tiny machine fighting to be heard. In that still room, you could hear sniffles from the gallery, the shuffling of a tissue box down the row. Ryan took the stand next. His voice had that thin, brittle edge that grief gives a man. He talked about the morning she left, the way her ponytail swung when she turned the corner. He said he'd spent 7 years trying to unlearn that sight, and he never could. He looked at Torres once during his testimony. That single glance said everything words couldn't. The defense tried to paint Torres as unstable, someone who didn't understand what he was doing. They called him lonely, misunderstood a man who acted out of compulsion. I've heard every version of that story before, and it always sounds the same, a plea for pity after a lifetime of cruelty. The prosecution didn't waste time debating his state of mind. They showed the data, each heartbeat, each spike, each fall. 11 days of deliberate choice. When the jury filed out for deliberation, I stepped outside. The courthouse steps were wet from a light drizzle, that familiar Portland mist that soaks your coat without you realizing it. Across the street, someone had set a single bouquet at the base of a tree wrapped in cellophane that whispered with the wind. I watched it for a long while. 3 hours later, the verdict came back guilty on all counts. Torres didn't flinch. No tears, no anger, just that same flat stare he'd worn since the day he was arrested. The judge sentenced him to life without parole. When it was over, the bailiffs led him away in cuffs. He didn't look back, not once. The door shut behind him, and it felt like the air finally moved again. Afterward, reporters swarmed the hallway microphones, flashing like lightning. Ryan stood before them quiet for a long time before he spoke. He didn't talk about revenge or closure. He thanked the people who'd refused to stop listening. The investigators, the tech worker who'd noticed a corrupted file, anyone who had kept her story alive. He announced a foundation in her name to help improve missing person technology. He said something that stayed with me ever since. A device doesn't have a voice, but my wife did, and through it she finally got to speak. Over the next months, that case changed the way we thought about technology and evidence. Fitbit and Apple both sent teams to meet with investigators. They developed a protocol to allow immediate release of preliminary data during emergencies. It became standard procedure across the country. Some called it the Park Protocol. I liked that. It gave her story a legacy larger than the horror. Still, nights were hard. I'd wake sometimes thinking of that basement. I could see the dust particles hanging in the air where our flashlights had cut through the way the metal links in those chains had glinted when we found them. You can't unsee things like that. You can't unhear the echo that followed when we climbed back up the shaft and sealed it for good. One afternoon, Sarah and I drove out to the National Law Enforcement Museum in Washington. They'd asked to display Jessica's Fitbit as part of a digital forensics exhibit. It was small, just a simple black band under glass, the screen dark now. Yet people stood in front of it for long minutes at a time, reading the small plaque beside it. I watched one woman trace the air just above the case as if she could feel the heartbeat it once measured. I thought about Marcus Webb, the technician who'd found the file by accident. I called him that night just to thank him again. He sounded humble, almost uncomfortable with the attention. "I was just doing my job," he said. But I reminded him that most breakthroughs in this line of work start exactly that way, one person refusing to ignore something that doesn't fit. He paused, then said quietly, "I still think about how it tried to reach us all that time. Feels almost alive." Ryan kept his promise. The foundation grew quickly. He partnered with universities, tech companies, even local police departments. Grants funded new software that could detect distress patterns in wearable data, sudden heart rate spikes, movement stoppages, location drops. Lives were saved because of it. Every time one of those alerts went out, I imagined Jessica's heartbeat somewhere behind it, still echoing through the code. A year after the verdict, I attended the memorial run downtown. Hundreds showed up in coral shirts, the same color she wore that morning. They ran the same 3.1-mile loop she'd taken every day, ending near the park that now bore her name. I didn't run. I walked near the back, keeping pace with the slower crowd. The sound of sneakers against pavement made a steady rhythm, almost like breathing. At the finish line, Ryan stood by the memorial stone, shaking hands, hugging strangers. When I reached him, we didn't need to say much. He looked at me and said, "She would have liked this." I told him she deserved it. The day ended warm and clear, rare for Portland. As the crowd thinned, I stayed behind. The sun dropped low, spilling gold across the Willamette River, and the city hummed with the ordinary life that keeps moving no matter what it loses. Somewhere in the distance, I heard the faint ping of a phone, syncing a sound so common now it barely registers. But to me, it felt like a reminder. That little tone had once been a cry for help that no one heard until it was too late. I drove home through streets I'd known my whole life, past coffee shops closing up and porches flickering with lamplight. People were settling in for the night, safe in their routines, believing in the comfort of the ordinary. I used to feel that way too. Now I know how thin that line really is, how quickly the world can tilt from familiar to unrecognizable. Back at the house, I set my keys on the counter and stood by the window watching rain start to fall again. The kind of soft drizzle that blurs everything just enough to make you question what's beyond it. I thought about the data logs, about those final readings where her heartbeat slowed steady and defiant even in darkness. Technology captured the facts, but something deeper lived in those numbers, her endurance, her will. Before I went to bed, I checked the file one last time. The copy I'd kept was encrypted and sealed, but I opened it anyway. The screen filled with those same jagged lines. 11 days. I scrolled slowly line by line until the graph steadied, then stopped. For a long time, I just sat there listening to the quiet hum of my computer, the rain tapping the window, the sound of a world still turning. We'd caught the man, found the truth, built a legacy from the wreckage. But in that stillness, it didn't feel like an ending. Cases like this never truly end. They just settle into the lives they've changed. Somewhere out there, I knew a runner laced her shoes, a device lit up on her wrist, and maybe because of Jessica, someone would come home safe. And yet, as I shut down the file and watched the room go dark, I couldn't shake the feeling that the story still had one last breath left in it, something waiting quietly beyond the reach of signal or time. I stayed on the force for another year after the trial, though my heart wasn't really in it anymore. Cases kept coming across my desk. Robberies, assaults, all the usual weight that keeps a city busy, but nothing held the same gravity. It wasn't that I'd lost interest. It was more that I'd seen how deep the silence could go. How someone could be alive right under your feet, and the world above could go on without ever noticing. Once you've stood in that kind of quiet, the rest of it never sounds the same. When I finally turned in my badge, the department threw a small gathering at a diner we'd all been going to for years. Sarah was there, still running cold cases, her hair streaked with gray now. She hugged me tighter than I expected and said, You taught me to listen past the noise. I told her she didn't need my help anymore. She'd already learned the hardest part of this job, patience, the kind that outlasts everyone else's hope. After retirement, my days slowed down. Mornings with coffee on the porch, evenings walking the dog through streets that had forgotten me. I kept up with Ryan through the foundation. He was doing good work, real work. Every few months, I'd see his name attached to another safety initiative, another partnership with tech companies improving their distress systems. Every time a missing person was found because a device sent out a signal in time, I thought of Jessica. In a strange way, her story had become part of the world's operating system, woven into the code, a quiet guardian in every runner's wrist. There was an exhibit that opened 2 years after the verdict down in D.C. The museum had recreated part of the case file for public display, Jessica's Fitbit under glass, a digital readout of her heart rate, and the photo of her smiling at a park run a few months before she disappeared. People lined up to see it. Some cried, some whispered to each other, but most just stood there still. The silence in that room was the same kind I'd felt at the crime scene, heavy, reverent, and unbroken. I didn't go for the ceremony. I went a week later on a quiet Wednesday morning. I waited until the crowd thinned, then walked up and laid my hand flat against the glass. It was warm from the lights above. For a second I closed my eyes and imagined all the lives that tiny piece of metal had touched. All the stories it had carried that no one could hear until we finally learned how to listen. Sarah told me once that she still dreams about the basement, the smell of rust and earth, the flicker of our flashlights in that stale air. I do too from time to time. But more often, I dream of light. The way it poured into the courtroom when the verdict was read. The way it hit Ryan's face during the memorial run, turning his tears gold. It's strange how the same city that once hid something so dark can also glow so bright when truth finally breaks through. I was there again this year for the 10th anniversary. The city had turned Jessica's old route into an annual charity run, and people came from all over. Families, college kids, whole running clubs wearing shirts printed with her initials. It was early morning, the air crisp, the river mist curling like smoke. Ryan was there, standing by the starting line, holding a stopwatch that he never started. I asked him why, and he said, "She always ran for herself." The time never mattered. When the crowd took off, their footsteps rolled down the street like a wave. I didn't run. I walked slow, tracing the same turns she used to take the same sidewalks I'd driven 1,000 times back when I thought answers lived somewhere on the surface. Now I knew better. Sometimes the truth lives underground or inside a machine or in the hearts of people who refuse to stop searching. Near the finish line, someone had set up a small display table with framed photos of other missing women from the region, some found, some still gone. I stood there for a while reading the names. It hit me how every one of those stories probably started the same way, a routine, a morning like any other. We spend so much of our lives trusting repetition, believing tomorrow will look like today. Maybe that's what makes these stories hurt so much. They remind us how fragile ordinary can be. After the run, the crowd gathered by the memorial stone in the park. The inscription read simply, "For every signal that couldn't break through." There were speeches, laughter, even some smiles. People brought their kids, their dogs, their hope. I stayed off to the side watching Ryan place fresh flowers beneath the plaque. He looked older now, but calmer too, like someone who'd made peace with never finding all the answers. When the ceremony ended, he found me and thanked me again, though I didn't deserve it. "You stayed," he said. That's what mattered. I told him it wasn't loyalty, it was guilt. But maybe the two aren't so different. That night I drove home through the quiet parts of Portland. Streetlights reflected off wet asphalt, the kind of shine that makes everything look softer. The radio was low, some late-night station playing an old Sinatra tune. I thought about Jessica's last 11 days, how a machine kept her heartbeat alive in numbers and timestamps. I used to think data was cold mechanical. Now I know better. That device didn't just record her, it remembered her, and in doing so it refused to let the rest of us forget. Sometimes I catch myself looking down at my own wrist when I'm out walking. I wear a simple watch, nothing fancy, but every time I glance at it I think about her. About how the smallest thing, a battery, a circuit, a string of code, can carry someone's story long after they're gone. It's humbling to realize that memory doesn't always live in people. Sometimes it hides in the things we leave behind, quietly waiting to be found. I keep a photo of her on my desk. Not the one the papers use, the smiling headshot, but a candid from a neighborhood barbecue taken a few weeks before she vanished. She's mid-laugh, holding a plate of watermelon hair a little messy from the breeze. Every time I look at it, I think about the word alive. Not just breathing, but really alive, the way she was that day. The world lost that version of her, but it gained something else: awareness, vigilance, change. It's not enough, but it's something. I've come to believe that justice isn't a moment, it's a process. The verdict, the headlines, the reforms, they're just milestones along a much longer road. Real justice lives in the spaces between those moments, in the safety protocols that save a life in a stranger who remembers a face in the quiet choice to care when it's easier to look away. That's where Jessica lives now, not in the tragedy, but in what came after. When I talk to younger detectives, I tell them this: listen to the small things. The cases that seem impossible are usually solved by something tiny, a sound, a word, a flicker of data trying to reach the surface. You can't always hear it right away, but if you stay long enough, if you care long enough, it'll find you. It always does. It's late. As I'm saying this, the house dark, except for the lamp over my desk. Rain started again, tapping steady on the window the same way it did that morning so many years ago when she ran past my driveway for the last time. I still remember the rhythm of her footsteps fading down the street. That sound has stayed with me longer than I expected. Steady, even hopeful. If this story stayed with you, share it not for views, but so no one's name gets lost to the dark. And if you've ever gone walking before dawn and the world felt too still to be harmless, trust that feeling. Somewhere out there, every quiet street and every heartbeat carries a memory. It's up to us to keep listening.